On a brisk night in early March, a couple of years ago, I returned home from work. Having worked late, it was nearly midnight when I entered my house, utterly fatigued. All I desired was to enjoy a chilled beer and relax on the couch, which is precisely what I did. There is something about the taste of alcohol that is particularly satisfying after a demanding day. I did not even bother to turn on the television. Instead, I settled onto the couch with my eyes closed and my feet propped up, attempting to push aside the persistent worries about my stressful life. As I flipped through the channels, I grew increasingly frustrated, as nothing seemed appealing. After several minutes of searching, I ultimately surrendered to the silence and chose to savor my beer without distraction. However, like many aspects of my life, the tranquility was short-lived. Within mere seconds, all the lights in my home abruptly went out. You know that faint, crackling sound that precedes a power outage? It is a noise I detest. Our house has a peculiar habit of losing power intermittently, and it still does. My immediate instinct was to step outside and check if any of the neighboring homes were experiencing the same issue. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, attempting to retain any warmth that I might not be able to reclaim if I failed to restore the power. Although it was late, I noticed at least one house on my street with its lights on, confirming that the issue lay with my own home. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, aware that this headache would undoubtedly ruin any enjoyment I had hoped to salvage from the evening. As I turned to re-enter, I found that the front door handle would not turn. Initially taken aback, I tried the handle several more times, but it was unmistakably locked. What was happening? I knocked on the door and called out my wife's name, wondering if she had awakened without my knowledge, but received no response. Peering through the glass, I found the interior shrouded in darkness. I hurried to the back, only to discover that door was locked as well. Panic began to set in. My wife often left doors unlocked, making it unusual for the back door to be secured. I dashed to the side of the house to check the breaker and halted abruptly. My hose, which I had distinctly remembered coiling, lay sprawled in the grass beneath the breaker box. The realization struck me with force. Someone had deliberately cut the power. Without a moment's hesitation, I raced to the nearest window and peered inside once more. This time, I discerned two flashlights moving erratically in the dark, indicating that two individuals were rummaging through my home. They were indeed stealing from me. Anger surged within me at the audacity of someone to commit such an act while I was present. I reached into my pocket to call the police, only to remember that I had left my phone on the couch. Cursing under my breath, I resolved to run to my neighbor's house to borrow his phone. As I began my journey towards the nearest house, a more ominous thought struck me. My wife was still inside, likely asleep and vulnerable to anyone who might be in the house. I could not leave her there, even for a moment longer. I dashed back to our home and hurriedly collected some loose stones from the yard, hurling them at our bedroom window in an attempt to rouse her. After the third stone, she opened the window. Before she could utter a word, I quietly informed her of the situation and instructed her to take cover in the closet. Without hesitation, she complied, disappearing from view. I then raced to my neighbor's house and knocked urgently on the door. I quickly explained the circumstances and used his phone to call the police. I stood on his porch, praying for my wife's safety. Eventually, the police arrived, and I rushed to one of their vehicles, relaying the situation as clearly as I could. They entered the house, but by that time, it was too late. The back door was wide open, and the intruder had vanished, taking with them numerous valuables. My wife was understandably more shaken than I was. What she recounted to me, and the police filled me with self-reproach for not safeguarding her better. To this day, I cannot forgive myself for leaving her in a house with potential assailants. Apparently, mere seconds after I told her to hide, she heard someone forcefully kick open the bedroom door. The intruder entered the room and cocked a gun, standing still for a few moments, clearly listening for any signs of life. She described it as the most terrifying experience of her life. I suspect the intruder heard me throwing the stones at the window. The most unsettling aspect is that we continue to live in this house, with no plans to move. At times, I reflect on what might have transpired had I not stepped outside for those fleeting moments. I have always existed in the shadow of my elder brother. While I do not harbor any resentment regarding this reality, it has undeniably been my experience. He has established a thriving business, and for the past 6 years, I have endeavored to emulate his success. Recently, I returned to live with my parents in an effort to regain my footing. Although this move felt like a regression, my options were limited. I occupied the basement to minimize my presence in their space as much as possible. The basement was not unpleasant. It resembled a small apartment, complete with its own kitchen, bathroom, office, bedroom, and even a television equipped with my old video games. Consequently, I seldom ventured upstairs, as I could comfortably reside down there independently, which alleviated my feelings of being a burden. One evening, either Friday or Saturday, a severe storm raged outside, with rain pounding against the windows and the wind shaking the entire house. The ferocity of the storm was remarkable, one of the most intense I had ever witnessed. At that time, my parents were away for the weekend, leaving me alone in the house, which I found quite agreeable. I recall feeling particularly cozy in the basement that night. I take great pleasure in listening to a fierce storm while nestled in a warm bed, especially late at night. There is something profoundly calming about being sheltered indoors during such tumultuous weather. Just as I was on the verge of drifting off to sleep, lulled by the gentle rhythm of the rain, the power abruptly went out. Everything shut down simultaneously, plunging me into complete darkness, and I let out a groan, irritated by the inconvenience. I surmised that the storm had likely caused a power outage, and for a brief moment, I contemplated checking the breaker. However, the thought of confronting the situation amidst the raging storm was unappealing, especially since I was preparing to retire for the night. Additionally, I was uncertain of the breaker's location. I decided it would be best to wait until morning to address the issue. As I lay there attempting to find a comfortable position, I was startled by a loud, unnatural thud against one of the basement windows. The sound was heavy, as if something had struck it forcefully. Initially, I considered the possibility that a branch had been dislodged by the wind or that a tree had fallen, but the noise was sharp and intentional, unlike anything I had previously encountered. Despite my inclination to remain idle, I could not dismiss the notion of a fallen tree, which was a significant concern beyond a mere power outage. Reluctantly, I rose from my bed and retrieved my phone, using its flashlight to navigate toward the window. The basement was enveloped in darkness, with only the sound of rain hammering against the glass and the distant rumble of thunder filling the air. I remember rubbing the sleep from my eyes in an effort to awaken myself. Holding my phone up to the window, I squinted through the glass and was nearly paralyzed with fear. A man's face was pressed against the window, staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, his skin pale and soaked. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met, and as soon as he noticed my gaze, he withdrew from the window. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone in shock. What had I just witnessed? My heart raced, and I struggled to breathe. But I had little time to process the encounter before another sound reached my ears, the sound of footsteps. I listened intently as the floorboards above creaked softly. There were people in the house. Between the horrifying sight I had just seen and the unsettling noises, I was on the brink of panic. I was alone at home, and it felt as though my sanctuary was being invaded. I found myself in the basement, struggling to think clearly amidst the gravity of the situation. Everything was unfolding rapidly, leaving me with no option but to take action. I hastily checked my phone, intending to call the police, only to realize that the power outage had disabled the Wi-Fi, and I had no cell service in the basement. I was effectively trapped, completely isolated. I understood that I could not simply wait for these intruders to carry out their intentions. I attempted to steady my nerves and consider my alternatives. I could not allow these strangers to wander freely in my home, yet I was reluctant to confront them directly. I felt ensnared in a no-win scenario. I resolved to attempt a stealthy ascent to the main floor, slip out the front door quietly, and contact the authorities once I was outside. With no other viable options, I proceeded cautiously, making my way up the basement stairs while keeping my footsteps as silent as possible. The sheer terror of that moment remains vivid. One never truly knows how they will respond to trauma until faced with it. Upon reaching the top, I cautiously surveyed the stairwell, and my heart sank at the sight of 3 figures wielding flashlights, moving about my darkened home. I stood frozen, paralyzed with fear, as one of the flashlights illuminated a figure just long enough for me to discern that they were armed with a gun. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I remained motionless, listening as they spoke in hushed tones. It was then that I heard one of them utter a phrase that heightened the tension even further. In a calm, almost nonchalant tone, one of them remarked, "Alex is in the basement. Go find him." The fear I experienced is beyond description, particularly at the moment I realized that they knew my name. I cautiously retreated down the stairs, striving to maintain a steady breath, yet internally, I was completely unraveling. Time was not on my side. They were approaching, and I was utterly unaware of what awaited me if they discovered my location. In a state of panic, I scanned my surroundings for possible hiding places, but there was no time to waste. I had to escape immediately, or I would face dire consequences. The only feasible exit was through one of the basement windows, but all were secured from the inside. With no alternatives, I seized a nearby stool, ascended to one of the window wells, and shattered the glass with my elbow. Shards scattered in all directions, but I paid them no mind as I hurriedly crawled through the broken window, emerging into the rain. I felt the cuts across my body, yet the pain was overshadowed by the adrenaline and fear surging through me. The downpour drenched me instantly as I dashed through the mud, careful not to lose my footing. Once I reached a safe distance from the house, I finally managed to get a signal and called the police. My hands trembled so violently that I struggled to grip the phone. By the time the authorities arrived to search the premises, the intruder had vanished. Numerous items had been stolen, and I won't even attempt to enumerate them all. The power outage had clearly been orchestrated, which was no surprise. My parents were furious and threatened to expel me from the house. I had to plead with them, asserting that I had done everything possible. Eventually, they calmed down, but I remained deeply unsettled by the entire incident. I still have no understanding of who those individuals were or how they had knowledge of my name, and I dread contemplating what could have transpired had they found me. I reside in a tranquil suburban neighborhood. However, there are several more densely populated towns within a short driving distance. A few months ago, I accepted a night shift security position at a warehouse located a few towns away. This facility was situated in an industrial area that extended for miles, and the building itself was quite isolated, featuring numerous tall metal shelves and several large loading docks. The work was straightforward, involving routine checks and basic security measures to ensure everything remained secured. Typically, it was quiet, often too quiet, but I appreciated the solitude, and most nights I could complete my shift without incident. On a Thursday night, during a heavy downpour, I found myself frequently checking my phone for storm updates, as I was not particularly eager to drive home under such conditions. Fortunately, there was little for me to do that evening, which was a relief. The power in the warehouse flickered a few times but ultimately remained stable, so I was not overly concerned. However, about an hour into my shift, the power finally failed, plunging the entire warehouse into complete darkness. I was frustrated, as I was the sole employee on duty that night, making me responsible for restoring the power. Although I had been trained for such situations, I never anticipated having to confront one. I exited my small security room to initiate the necessary procedures. I had been instructed to unplug some of the large machines before checking the breakers, so I proceeded to do just that. My flashlight served as the only source of illumination in the entire facility, creating an eerily unsettling atmosphere. The silence felt denser in the absence of light, and every creak of the building resonated more loudly without the background hum of the lights. My footsteps echoed significantly, amplifying the odd sensation as I patrolled one of the aisles. I heard a loud metallic clattering resonating from deeper within the warehouse, which startled me momentarily. However, I dismissed it as merely the storm rattling the roof or the metal shutters. Nevertheless, I resolved to investigate the source, moving cautiously down each aisle. As I turned a corner, I was taken aback. A faint beam of light was gliding along the shelves ahead. It resembled my own flashlight and extinguished as swiftly as I had noticed it. Yet, I was certain I had seen it. No one was supposed to be present until morning, and my heart began to race at the thought of another person being there. I contemplated calling out, but ultimately refrained. Upon reaching the location where I had seen the light, I found it absent. The aisle was deserted, filled only with rows of crates and towering shelves of inventory. Panic set in as I reassured myself that I was not imagining things. I had indeed witnessed something unusual. I had a duty to fulfill, and while I considered contacting the police, I hesitated, uncertain if my observation warranted such action. In retrospect, had the company not provided me with a taser, I likely would have called the authorities immediately. As I continued my patrol, an unusual odor assaulted my senses, a musty, metallic scent reminiscent of rusted metal or stagnant water. The smell emanated from one of the loading bays, a dimly lit area of the warehouse where crates were piled from floor to ceiling. Following the scent with my flashlight, I noticed something peculiar. My beam illuminated two sets of wet footprints on the polished concrete floor, leading into one of the storage aisles. At that moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to flee and contact the police, but I knew I could not do so just yet. If anyone had been investigating, it was my responsibility. That was essentially my role. My curiosity got the better of me, prompting me to pursue the lead. I kept my flashlight directed downward, not wanting to reveal my position. As I approached, I began to hear faint whispers, barely discernible, as if two individuals were engaged in conversation several miles away. Although I could not decipher the words, the tone conveyed a sense of tension, almost urgency. I switched off my flashlight and held my breath, striving to remain silent. Gripping my taser, I cautiously moved closer to the source of the whispers. Upon turning the corner, I raised my flashlight to confront whoever was present, only to find that there was absolutely no one in front of me. The whispers had also ceased, which was utterly bewildering. They had been right there moments ago. How could they have vanished so swiftly? The entire scenario left me unsettled, and I concluded that I was not compensated sufficiently for this ordeal. I decided to head directly to the circuit room to restore power, disregarding my other responsibilities. Upon arrival, I began to fumble with the breakers in the darkness when I heard a scraping sound nearby. I swung my flashlight around and noticed the edge of a metal tool lying just a few feet away, a crowbar. It had not been there previously, indicating a serious situation. Whoever was in the vicinity might have had harmful intentions. I shouted that I was armed, a statement that was somewhat of a bluff given my taser, and I needed to exit as quickly as possible. My nerves were frayed, but I recognized that my life was far more valuable than any repercussions I might face for leaving. As I made my way to the door, a loud metallic crash resonated from the far end of the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. I experienced a sudden rush of adrenaline and began to run towards the source of the noise. As I turned the corner, I encountered two figures clad entirely in black, one of whom was wielding a crowbar identical to one I had just passed. They glanced at me for a brief moment before, without any warning, they began sprinting directly towards me. In that instant, I acted on instinct and fled, all the confidence I had previously gathered evaporating in an instant. I could hear their footsteps thundering behind me, yet I dared not look back. I maneuvered through the aisles, hoping to navigate the space more effectively than they could. After what seemed like an eternity, the sound of their footsteps diminished. I paused to catch my breath, realizing they were no longer pursuing me. Eventually, I made my way to the exit and stepped outside, where I immediately contacted the police, urging them to arrive as swiftly as possible. To my relief, they responded promptly, although by that time, the two individuals had vanished. The officers were quite helpful and even assisted me in restoring my power. However, my boss was far less understanding. He reprimanded me for fleeing, and I nearly lost my job over the incident. The entire experience remained surreal to me. It was evident that those individuals were toying with me, yet they pursued me with a weapon. The most troubling aspect is that I continue to work night shifts in that warehouse, although my boss has since ensured that at least 2 employees are scheduled for each shift. I remain uncertain about the entire situation, but I am simply grateful that those individuals did not catch up to me.